Okay, this is English 201, week 6, part 2. I'm just going to pick up in the middle of page 15 with the paragraph that starts Gregor's sister was exhausted. Gregor's sister was exhausted from going out to work, and looking after Gregor, as she had done before, was even more work for her. But even so, his mother ought certainly not to have taken her place. Gregor, on the other hand, ought not to be neglected. Now, though, the charwoman was here. This elderly widow, with a robust bone structure that made her able to withstand the hardest things in her life, wasn't really repelled by Gregor. Just by chance one day, rather than any real curiosity, she opened the door to Gregor's room and found herself face to face with him. He was taken totally by surprise. No one was chasing him, but he began to rush to and fro, while she just stood there in amazement with her hands crossed in front of her. From then on, she never failed to open the door slightly every evening and morning and look briefly in on him. At first, she would call to him as she did so with words that she probably considered friendly, such as, "Come on, then, you old dung beetle," or "Look at the old dung beetle there." Gregor never responded to being spoken to in that way, but just remained where he was without moving, as if the door had never been opened. If only they told this charwoman to clean up his room every day, instead of letting her disturb him for no reason whenever she felt like it. One day, early in the morning, while a heavy rain struck the window panes, perhaps indicating that spring was coming, she began to speak to him in that way once again. Gregor was so resentful of it that he started to move towards her. He was Gregor was so resentful of it that he started to move toward her. He was slow and infirm, but it was like a kind of attack. Instead of being afraid, the charwoman just lifted up one of the chairs from the near door and stood there with her mouth open, clearly intending not to close her mouth until the chair in her hand had been slammed down into Gregor's back. "Aren't you coming any closer, then?" she asked when Gregor turned around again, and she calmly put the chair back in the corner. Gregor had almost entirely stopped eating. If only he happened to find if Only if he happened to find himself next to the food that had been prepared for him, he might take some of it into his mouth to play with it, leave it there for a few hours, and then, more often than not, spit it out again. At first he thought it was the distress at the state of the room that stopped him from eating, but he had soon got used to the changes made there. They had got into the habit of putting things in his room that they had no room for anywhere else, and there were now many such things, as one of the rooms in the flat had been rented out to 3 gentlemen. These earnest gentlemen, all 3 of them had full beards, as Gregor learned peering through the crack in the door one day, were painfully insistent on things being tidy. This meant not only in their own room, but since they had taken a room in this establishment, the entire flat, and especially the kitchen. Unnecessary clutter was something they could not tolerate, especially if it was dirty. They had, moreover, brought most of their own furnishings and equipment with them. For this reason, many things had become superfluous, which, although they could not be sold, the family did not wish to discard. All those things found their way into Gregor's room. Dustbins from the kitchen found their way in there too. The charwoman was always in a hurry, and anything she couldn't use for the time being, she would just chuck in there. He, fortunately, would see no more than the object and the hand that held it. The woman most likely meant to fetch the things back out again when she had time or opportunity, or to throw everything out in one go, which is what actually happened was that they were left where they landed when they had first been thrown, unless Gregor made his way through the junk and moved it somewhere else. At first, he moved it because, with no other room free where he could crawl about, he was forced to, but later on he came to enjoy it, although moving about in that way left him sad and tired to death, and he would remain immobile for hours afterwards. The gentleman who rented the room would sometimes take their evening meal at home, in the living room that was used by everyone, and so the door to his room was often kept closed in the evening. But Gregor found it easy to give up having the door open. He had, after all, often failed to make use of it when it was open, and, without the family having noticed it, lain in his room in the darkest corner. One time, though, the charwoman left the door to the living room slightly opened, and it remained open when the gentleman who had rented the room came in the evening and the light was put on. They sat at the family table, where formerly Gregor had taken his meals with his father and mother. They unfolded the serviettes and picked up their knives and forks. Gregor's mother immediately appeared in the doorway with a dish of meat, and soon behind her came his sister with a dish piled high with potatoes. The food was steaming and filled the room with its smell. The gentlemen bent over the dishes set in front of them, as if they wanted to test the food before eating it, and the gentleman in the middle, who seemed to count as an authority for the other two, did indeed cut off a piece of meat while it was still in its dish, clearly wishing to establish whether it was sufficiently cooked or whether it should be sent back to the kitchen. It was to his satisfaction, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been looking on anxiously, began to breathe again and smiled. The family themselves ate in the kitchen. Nevertheless, Gregor's father came into the living room before he went into the kitchen, bowed once with his cap in his hand, and did his round of the table. The gentlemen stood as one, and mumbled something into their beards. Then, once they were alone, they ate in near perfect silence. It seemed remarkable to Gregor that above all the various noises of their eating, their chewing teeth could still be heard, as if they had wanted to show Gregor that you need teeth in order to eat something, and it was not possible to perform anything with jaws that are toothless, however nice they might be. "I'd like to eat something," said Gregor anxiously, "but not anything like they're eating. They do feed themselves, and here I am, dying." Throughout all this time, Gregor could not remember having heard the violin being played, but this evening it began to be heard from the kitchen. The three gentlemen already finished their meal, and the one in the middle produced a newspaper, given a page to each of the others, and now they leant back in their chairs, reading them and smoking. When the violin began playing, they became sensitive. They became attentive, stood up, and went tiptoe over to the door of the hallway, where they stood pressed against each other. Someone must have heard them in the kitchen, as Gregor's father called out, "Is the playing perhaps unpleasant for the gentleman? We can stop it straight away." "On the contrary," said the middle gentleman, "would the young lady not like to come in and play for us here in the room, where it is, after all, much more cozy and comfortable?" "Oh, yes, we'd love to," called back Gregor's father, as if he had been the violin player himself. The gentleman stepped back into the room and waited. Gregor's father soon appeared with the music stand, his mother with the music, and his sister with the violin. She calmly prepared everything for her to begin playing. His parents, who had never rented a room out before, and therefore showed an exaggerated courtesy towards the three gentlemen, did not even dare sit on their own chairs. His father leant against the door with his right hand, pushed in between two buttons of his uniformed coat. His mother, though, was offered a seat by one of the gentlemen and sat, leaving the chair where the gentleman happened to have placed it, out of the way in a corner. His sister began to play. Father and mother paid close attention, one on each side, to the movements of her hands. Drawn in by the playing, Gregor had dared come forward a little, and already had his head in the living room. Before, he had taken great pride in how considerate he was, but now it hardly occurred to him that he had become so thoughtless about the others. What's more, there was now all the more reason to keep himself hidden, as he was covered in the dust that lay everywhere in his room, and flew up at the slightest movement. He carried threads, hairs, and remains of food about on his back and sides. He was much too indifferent to everything now to lay on his back and wipe himself on the carpet like he had used to do several times a day. And despite this condition, he was not too shy to move forward a little onto the immaculate floor of the living room. Immaculate is like clean. No one noticed him, though. The family was totally preoccupied with the violin playing. At first, the three gentlemen had put their hands in their pockets and come up far too close behind the music stand to look at all the notes being played, and they must have disturbed Gregor's sister, but soon, in contrast with the family, they withdrew to the window with their heads sunk and talking to each other at half volume, and they stayed by the window while Gregor's father observed them anxiously. It really now seemed very obvious that they had expected to hear something beautiful or entertaining. They expected to hear some beautiful or entertaining violin playing, but had been disappointed that they had had enough of the whole performance, and it was only now, out of politeness, that they allowed their peace to be disturbed. It was especially unnerving the way all the smoke blew from their cigarettes toward their mouths and noses. Yet Gregor's sister was playing beautifully. Her face was lent to one side, following the lines of the music with a careful and melancholy expression. Gregor crawled a little farther forward, keeping his head close to the ground so that he could meet her eyes if the chance came. Was he an animal, if music could captivate him so? It seemed to him he was being shown the way to the unknown nourishment he had been yearning for. He was determined to make his way forward to his sister and tug at her skirt and show her she might come into his room with her violin, as no one appreciated her playing here as much as he would. He never wanted to let her out of his room, not while he lived anyway. His shocking appearance should for once be of some use to him. He wanted to be at every door of his room at once to hiss and spit at the attackers. His sister should not be forced to stay with him, though, but stay of her own free will. She would sit beside him on the couch with her ear bent down to him while he told her how he had always intended to send her to the conservatory, how he would have told everyone about it last Christmas. Had Christmas really come and gone already? If this misfortune hadn't gotten in the way, and refused to let anyone dissuade him from it. On hearing all this, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would climb up to her shoulder and kiss her neck, which, since she had been going out to work, she had kept free without any necklace or collar. Pick it up in the next video.